Hey, as we talk about Acts 25 today, I want to let you know that my message this morning is really about issues related to mental health and suicide. So I wanted to give you a fair warning ahead of time because I know how heavy this kind of conversation can be, but I think it's an important conversation to have. I ask that you would stick with me through the message, and if I touch on anything that is true of you and you feel like you need someone to talk to, please know that I am here for each and every one of you. So are our elders. If you don't feel comfortable to me, there's at least one person in this church who you would feel comfortable talking about your issues with, and know that you're not alone. That's why I'm preaching this message today, because I know precisely how many people, not only here in the church, but in our community at large, I know how many people are hurting, and we need to be aware of that. So this was really sparked, my thoughts about this message were sparked a few days ago when I had the opportunity to meet the former battalion chief of the Westminster Fire Department. He came to the church, and during the course of our conversation, he mentioned to me that he and his wife had been looking for a church. So I talked our church up quite a bit. I let him know a little bit about all of you, and I told him all of the ways that you have stepped up in this past year to serve the needs of the community. I said something along the lines of, there are so many hurting people in Westminster right now, and we are doing everything that we possibly can to serve as many people as we possibly can. And the battalion chief's entire demeanor changed as I said this. He replied to me saying, "You're right. People are hurting in terrible ways. Most people are completely unaware of the grim realities that our first responders are currently dealing with." I asked, "What do you mean?" He said, "In Westminster alone, we are responding to approximately 5 to 6 suicides or suicide attempts every single day. The normal rate," he continued to tell me, "is 1 every few days." And I just get this sense as I talk to people that so many have just had enough. People have just had it. This matches up with what I've heard from my friends who run In Memoriam Funeral Home in Broomfield. This past year, they've had a massive influx of cases brought on by overdoses, either accidental or otherwise, and suicides. Matches up what we've heard from other sources. I think I mentioned to you a few months ago that Children's Hospital recently declared a mental health state of emergency because they are so inundated with adolescent suicide cases, whether they're actual successful suicide attempts or just attempts. They are completely inundated and they don't know how to deal with it. That's Children's Hospital. That's a pretty big and powerful organization, and they're saying this is insane. I heard another story, and this one's kind of a little bit lighter, but it still points to the fact that people are just hurting right now. This is a story that came out about an American Airlines flight this past week about a flight attendant who was attacked by a passenger. Did any of you hear about this? The flight attendant apparently bumped the passenger while moving through the first-class cabin, and she apologized, but the passenger left his seat, confronted her as she stood in the galley of the aircraft, then he punched her in the face. And a representative for American Airlines came about and said, this kind of behavior really started last year with various COVID protocols, but in this particular instance, it had nothing to do with mask mandates or anything of that nature. The representative went on to say, our passengers have changed. Their behavior on our flights, the safety of our flight attendants, the safety of our passengers, every day is being threatened here. That's what we're hearing again and again and again. First responders, funeral home directors, doctors, nurses, flight attendants, pastors, counselors, teachers, social workers, servers in restaurants, grocery store workers. We can all tell you that people generally aren't doing very well right now. The stress and anxiety caused by COVID and all of the political and social and economic unrest of the past few years has just pushed so many people beyond their emotional capacities. And then you add on all the pressures of normal life. I guess what is normal life anymore? But you add in all of the pressures of normal life. Pressures of normal life that have been exacerbated by all of the recent staffing shortages and supply chain issues and other challenges caused directly and indirectly by COVID. For example, our cat died last week. We noticed that he was sick on Wednesday, so I took him out to the emergency vet. And I don't think the emergency vet would have done anything other than offer to euthanize him Wednesday evening. So I took him to the emergency vet with the hope that we could ease his suffering a little bit sooner. But this emergency vet that we went to, we've been there several times with both of our pets before. We always get in right away. There were probably 8 cars in the parking lot that night. Hours and hours I would have had to have waited in my car with a cat, and I finally decided, you know what? I'm not going to let the cat die in the car. We need to get him back home. And so we had someone come to our house the next day. But I'm sure some of you have dealt with similar kinds of challenges. Normal, everyday life stuff that should be really easy has been exacerbated by all of the stuff going on in the world right now. I completely agree with a battalion chief that for some people it's just more than folks can bear. In the midst of all of these overwhelming circumstances, so many people have just given up or are on the verge of giving up. Now, I know how difficult all of this is to hear. It's not easy to hear this kind of stuff. It is a lot to take in. And I hope you know that I'm not sharing this with you to make you feel sad or depressed or worried. In fact, I'm sharing all of this with you to make you feel hopeful. Okay? That's my end goal. That's my aim today, is to leave you with hope. And I want you to leave this church today energized to share that hope with other people. Because I think more than anything, as I'm going to say several times this morning, more than anything, people in our church, people in Westminster, people in Colorado, people in the United States, people throughout the world, what we need is hope. People are living their lives in despair. They don't know how to escape that despair. They need to know that things can and things will get better. Okay? We need to be energized to share that hope. This is a lot to take in, but it's life. And ultimately, our faith in Jesus is completely meaningless if it doesn't have real, meaningful, applicable implications for our lives here in the present. And that's what I want to show you today. Scripture is applicable. The gospel is applicable. Jesus is applicable to the circumstances we find ourselves in here in 2021. Now, before I get into our passage this morning, I do think it is so important for churches to talk about mental health and to talk about issues related to suicide. Really, for a lot of different reasons, but the main reason it's on my heart this week is because we know that these things are on the rise in very concerning ways. Chances are that you know someone who is currently dealing with a mental health issue, with suicidal ideation. There's also a good chance that you have felt that way in this past year. And first and foremost, if that's you, again, you are not alone in that whatsoever. The reason that I think that we churches need to talk about these issues is because they are incredibly common and are affecting more and more people every single day. Suicide is the 10th leading cause of death in all age groups combined. With young people, I forget the exact age breakdown, but it is the second cause of death in younger people, only following accidental injuries. And actually, hate to say it, but once you're over 80, your risk for suicide goes up once again. So you should be aware of that. Historically, these kinds of topics have essentially been stigmatized or brushed off as issues of spiritual warfare by many pastors and by many church leaders. And while I do agree that there is a massive spiritual component to what is going on right now, so don't get me wrong there. There is spiritual warfare going on right now, and I think that's a major reason that we are in the mess that we are in this current time. So understand that. But I also believe that there is a massive biological and psychological aspect to all of this as well. Some people are simply wired in a manner that makes them feel more depressed or anxious than others. Some people have experienced traumatic circumstances that make them feel more depressed and anxious than others. My point is that we can't stigmatize mental health or suicide, nor can we ignore them, because these are real issues that people in our community, both in the church and in our extended sphere of influence, deal with on a daily basis. I think we would all agree that we want to compassionately serve those who are hurting, but before we can help those in need, we have to be aware of the complex issues that they're facing. And we have to be willing to serve people as holistic beings, not only as spiritual beings, but we're called to love God with our minds, bodies, hearts, and souls. And just as we're called to love God with our full being, we're called to love others in their full being. We are called to meet their physical, emotional, and mental health needs in addition to their spiritual needs. I think there are many ways that you and I can go about doing this. I think that if our church really rallies together and we say, we're not going to stand for this, we're not going to let anyone in our community succumb to this, and we're going to do whatever we can to make sure that nobody else out there succumbs to this, we'll make some inroads. So here's my thoughts. I have 4 thoughts for you today in ways that we can take a stand against these really concerning trends. First, we can create an environment in which folks simply feel safe to share their struggles. Because in environments where mental health and suicide are stigmatized, people don't want to share because they feel that they're going to be judged. But environments in which conversations about mental health are normalized, people feel a lot more comfortable sharing precisely because they're not worried about being judged. And I want our church, I want Westminster Christian Church to be the kind of space, to be the kind of place where people can come in and say, hey, I'm feeling really down today. Let's talk about it. Or I'm feeling really down during the season of life. Let's talk about it. Let's foster that kind of environment together. Second, we can encourage people to get appropriate help from appropriate people. Those who are feeling depressed, anxious, or suicidal due to a chemical imbalance need the help of a medical professional who is trained to treat such imbalances through medication. Okay? I will be the first. If you ever come into a counseling appointment with me, that's one of the first questions I ask. Have you talked to your physician about this? Are you on any medication? I believe that medication can help resolve those chemical imbalances that cause depression and anxiety, that can cause depression and anxiety. In addition to that, those who are feeling depressed, anxious, or suicidal due to trauma need the help of a mental health professional who is trained to guide people through the complexities of the trauma that they've experienced. And those who are feeling depressed, anxious, or suicidal due to isolation, that's actually one of the leading factors in determining whether or not someone is at risk for suicide are they isolated? Major reason why we've seen suicide rates skyrocket this past year. People have been cut off from their loved ones. And if people are isolated, what they need more than anything else is the presence of loving family, friends, and community. Okay? 3 things we can do. We can encourage people to get help from the appropriate people. Third, we can receive training from programs that teach suicide prevention methods. And one such program that I'm currently involved in is called QPR. It's designed to be just like CPR. You use CPR to revive someone who's had some kind of heart problem or respiratory problem. QPR is designed to help people to learn the signs of suicide and to respond to them appropriately. QPR just refers to question, persuade, and refer. You question how people are feeling, you persuade them that life is worth living, and then you refer them to those appropriate people who can help. And I want to tell you today that I think this is such a vital program that I'm willing to pay for 3 of you to get trained in QPR, okay? It's at like $79, so I'm willing to pay for 3 of you to get this training. This is to any of you. I know a few of our elders in the past have said that they would be interested in this. If you are thinking, man, that would be a really vital skill set to get, come talk to me after church. The 3 of you that come talk to me first will get that for free. If you don't get it for free, it is a good investment. Any of you can go online to the QPR Institute and sign up to receive this training. I think it is absolutely vital. So come talk to me if you're interested in learning about more after church. I'll be up here for a few minutes and we can chat, okay? But finally, and I think perhaps most importantly of all, the thing that we can do to help people in their despair right now is simply offer them the hope of the gospel. We can simply offer them the hope of the gospel. I said this already, but it's worth reiterating that there is no doubt that feelings of hopelessness have contributed to the current state of things. To be sure, people are giving up because they feel stuck and think that things won't ever get better. Their burdens seem insurmountable, the odds impossible. It's just one thing after another, another after another. But as we talked about last week, we Christians believe that the resurrection of Jesus is evidence that God is making all things better, that God is making all things right, that God is making all things ultimately okay. And additionally, what we have to learn from today's scripture is that the resurrection is also evidence that Jesus overcomes impossible odds on our behalf. Jesus overcomes impossible odds on our behalf. We're going to be taking a look at the entire section of Acts 25 today, the entire chapter, I should say, Acts 25, 1 through 27. And I want to read through the entire chapter so that I can show you what I mean in all of this and why it matters for us today. So Zach is going to come forward and read for us. You're welcome to read along in the Pew Bible or your own Bible. You can follow along on the projection screens as well. Let us hear the word of God. Zach.
Good morning. 3 days after Festus had arrived in the province, he went up from Caesarea to Jerusalem, where the chief priests and the leaders of the Jews gave him a report against Paul. They appealed to him and requested, as a favor to them against Paul, to have him transferred to Jerusalem. They were, in fact, planning an ambush to kill him along the way. Festus replied that Paul was being kept at Caesarea, and that he himself intended to go there shortly. So, he said, "Let those of you who have the authority come down with me, and if there is anything wrong about the man, let them accuse him." After he had stayed among them not more than 8 or 10 days, he went down to Caesarea. The next day he took his seat on the tribunal and ordered Paul to be brought. When he arrived, the Jews who had gone down from Jerusalem surrounded him, bringing many serious charges against him, which they could not prove. Paul said in his defense, "I have in no way committed an offense against the laws of the Jews, or against the temple, or against the emperor." But Festus, wishing to do the Jews a favor, asked Paul, "Do you wish to go up to Jerusalem and be tried there before me on these charges?" Paul said, "I am appealing to the emperor's tribunal. This is where I shall be tried. I have done no wrong to the Jews, as you very well know. Now if I am in the wrong and have committed something for which I deserve to die, I am not trying to escape death. But if there is nothing to their charges against me, no one can turn me over to them. I appeal to the emperor." Then Festus, after he had conferred with his council, replied, "You have appealed to the emperor you will go."
The passage does continue on, but we'll wrap up there for the sake of time. What I really want to emphasize in Acts 25, this is really the culmination of what we have seen Paul go through in the past several weeks. Paul went to Jerusalem, and while he was in the temple, he was attacked by a mob that was angry that he was in the temple. They didn't like what he was teaching about the resurrection. The Romans found out what was going on with him, and they carried him away, put him in the barracks. And as Paul's being carried away into the barracks, he offers his testimony, he offers his defense to the mobs that tried to attack him. That's his first defense. And then he has to go and defend himself before the Sanhedrin. And then he has to go defend himself before the governors of Judea. Next week, we're going to talk about how he had to defend himself against King Agrippa. And eventually, we don't read about this in Acts. We do know that at the end of his life, Paul had to also offer his testimony before the emperor himself. My point is that again and again and again, we see that the odds were completely stacked against Paul. Again and again and again, we see Paul defending himself against false accusations and trials led by increasingly powerful people. And through it all, he maintained this calm and cool and collected composure. How did he do that? How did Paul keep from buckling under the weight of that kind of pressure? Luke doesn't explicitly tell us how Paul felt during all of these trials. We know a lot about what he said to defend himself, but we don't really know a lot about what was going inside internally. And I'm going to make the assumption that at the very least, Paul felt overwhelmed and discouraged. If you're having to go defend your life before Roman governors and then kings and emperors, you're going to feel pretty down in the midst of that process. Paul probably did. Think of everything else he had gone through leading up to these trials. People had threatened him. He was beaten. He had been maligned. Nobody can go through all of that as consistently as Paul did and not be affected emotionally and mentally. In fact, a few weeks ago, we mentioned that Jesus actually appeared to Paul in a vision on the night of his first trial before the Sanhedrin. Do you remember what Jesus said to Paul? Keep up your courage. That Jesus appeared to Paul to encourage him at this moment reveals, I think, the kind of state that Paul was in. He was overwhelmed, he was discouraged, perhaps not quite ready to give up, though I do have to wonder if that thought ever crossed his mind. This is too much for me to handle. I don't think I can keep doing this. Now, I've never had to defend myself before a court before, although there was one time in my life where I was kind of close to it. That's another story for another day, okay? So I can't quite relate to what Paul was going through, at least in that aspect, but I definitely know what it's like to be pushed to my limits. Like so many others, 2021 has been the kind of year for me, that kind of year for me personally, that kind of year where I feel overwhelmed and discouraged, the kind of year that has led me to wonder how much more stress I can possibly take. Now, please don't get me wrong within that statement. I've had a lot of wonderful experiences this year as well. The birth of Nate, moving into a new house that we absolutely love, Sam starting kindergarten, and all of you, as I said earlier, have been so incredibly supportive. You've helped to meet the needs of our community in so many tangible ways, and I have been so encouraged by that. But I'd be lying if I said that 2021 has been a good year, because there's been a lot of sorrow mixed in with all of the blessings. I think of all the members that our church has lost. I have officiated 10 funerals already this year. That's difficult. I think about the challenges facing our church and every other church as we continue to rebound from 2020. Heck, the stress of raising 3 kids, one of whom is 8 months old and still not sleeping through the night, as 2 full-time parents, quite honestly, that's overwhelming in and of itself. But I feel like I have it pretty easy in comparison to what some of you at home have been through this past year. Like Paul, you've been through an escalating series of difficult situations, car problems, house problems, health problems, perhaps even the death of a loved one. They say that bad things tend to happen in threes, but I've been doing this pastor gig long enough to know that for some people, the hits really never stop coming. There are a few of you in this room today who know exactly what that's like, and as such, I'm guessing that there are a few of you in this room today who have found yourself in some pretty dark places this past year and beyond. You feel stuck and think that things won't ever get better. Your burdens seem insurmountable, the odds impossible. It's just one thing after another and another after another. How do you persevere when life feels that way? How do you make it through a season like that? How do you maintain your composure? How do you keep from buckling under the weight of that kind of pressure? The answer is so much more simple than we might think. You see, along with the medical and psychological resources that are available to us, you and I also have an incredibly unique resource as Christians. We have hope in the good news of Jesus' resurrection. That is ultimately where Paul found his strength to persevere in the face of impossible odds, and I think it's where you and I think it's where the people outside of the walls of this church can find strength to persevere as well. As I said earlier, the resurrection is evidence that Jesus overcomes impossible odds on our behalf. Think about that. As far as I'm concerned, very few people have ever escaped death. Very few people have overcome death. The odds of overcoming death are, quite frankly, pretty terrible. But through his resurrection, Jesus overcame death. And if Jesus overcame death of all things, think of everything else that he can overcome on our behalf. If Jesus overcame death of all things, then we can rest assured knowing that there is nothing that he can't overcome. As Christians, things might get dark at times, and even as Christians, even incredibly faithful Christians deal with issues of depression, anxiety, and suicidal ideation. Just because we're believers does not mean that we are exempt from these kinds of struggles. Be aware of that. In fact, I have a little book for any of you who are interested, just another resource. I'm going to leave it up on the communion table. First one to get this gets to borrow it, and then you can bring it back to the church for the next person who's interested. I've already loaned it out to a few church members. It's called Companions in the Darkness, 7 Saints Who Struggled with Depression and Doubt. It's about 7 prominent Christians who had these kinds of issues and how they found light in the midst of so much darkness. So, first one to get it can borrow it. Yes, even Christians can experience the darkness of life at times. But there is always a glimmer of light. There is always a glimmer of light that beckons us forward. It might be faint, it might be far away, but it is always there. Don't give up. You can make it. You will reach the light eventually. And once you do, you are called to live the life of costly discipleship, and you are called to carry that light forward so that others who are living in despair can have the hope of Jesus, so that they can have the hope that whatever impossible odds they're facing, Jesus will overcome those odds on their behalf. Hope that because of the resurrection, everything will be okay.